welcome back. In the next panel discussion, the focus is going to be on social media, big tech, and censorship. Let me introduce the moderator, Gergely Szilvai, senior journalist of Mandiner. Gergely, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like to call for the panelists. First, Rav Schuler, chief correspondent in the Parliament Office of the Bild. Previously, he was an editor and Balkan correspondent of the Neue Zeit and editor of Die Welt. Please. That's mine. Dr. Norman Lewis, who is a writer, speaker, and consultant on innovation and technology. He is also recognized worldwide as an expert on future trends and user behaviors regarding technology, innovation, and adoption. He was formerly a director of PwC. Next one is Gladden Pepin, visiting fellow of Mathias Collegium, and the associate professor of politics at the University of Dallas, also the co-founder and deputy editor of American Affairs, and he also has many titles too. Thank you for joining us. Marian Őri, who is the head of the foreign desk at the Hungarian conservative daily newspaper Magyar Hírlap. She mainly focuses on EU and Visegrad 4 affairs. And the last one is Arnaud Dacier, who is a French entrepreneur with a particular focus on the digital sphere, media landscape and communications. He worked for the Ministry of Economy, Finance and Industry and founded one of the first web agencies in France. Thank you very much. Before my questions, I would like to start with the short story. Our topic is platforms or publishers, as you see it, as one of the major questions today about the social media. And I just would like to focus on the topic with a short story. After that, I will give you the floor with my questions. One of the first visiting fellows at the MCC before Gladden Pepin was Rodri Hare from Louisiana, who is the journalist of the American Conservative and publisher of 2 books. And we published an essay of Rodri Hare at the Mandiner in Hungarian. And after that, we almost got a Facebook ban for our advertisements. And we managed to get in touch with the Hungarian Facebook moderator who kindly informed us that Rodri Hare is labeled at the Facebook as dangerous because many of who do not like him also report him. This moderator recommended us kindly not to publish and survey Rod, his articles. And additionally, he kindly recommended to label a Hungarian major of a small village at the border, László Toroczkai, as far-right. And he also recommended that's the best to not write news about him. Whatever his political stance, he's a major of a small town, and he's an elected officer, not like Facebook, so we were shocked. Also, everybody knows the story of Donald Trump's FB and Twitter account. Also, the story of a Spanish Vox politician who was banned because he published a post to claim that men cannot breastfeed. Also, there are dozens of Hungarian conservative opinion leaders who has been banned for a time for their contents from Facebook and not from Twitter because Twitter is not so used at Hungary. So Facebook, Twitter, and other social platforms created a problem for the international community when they decided to moderate users and to use fact-checkers. In America, both Democrats and Republicans would like to regulate somehow the phenomenon. Also, the EU focuses on this problem, although from the point of view of hate speech, moderation, data privacy, and business rules. So my first question would be to you. Have you experienced in your practice some kind of questionable moderation or fact-checking in social platforms? So personal stories, if you have any.
Well, if you work for Axel Springer and if you work for Bild, you are confronted on a daily basis with hatred, and some people are wishing that we were hanging on lanterns and something like this. And the interesting point is that if you go to the police and tell them about it, they say, okay, we noticed this, but don't be very hopeful that anybody of them will be sentenced. So it's impossible to stop this kind of left-wing hatred. Otherwise, those fact-checkers are very has a very low threshold in banning everything they call far right, new right, and something like this. And that the problem behind this two sides is that the conservative part of the society thinks that it's okay to want, for example, migration, and the left-wing part of the society thinks it's not allowed to ban migration. So it's an illiberal point of view that we have to face in those debates, and that is a problem.
Well, I haven't been banned from Facebook, I'm sorry to say. I'm working on it. I work on it every day. I write a lot for a magazine called Spiked. I write for Unheard. I write for RT. And what I find amazing is every time I publish an article, there's always a nice little box that Facebook puts on there which says, if you would like to find out the truth about X, then click here. In other words, they feel it necessary, their moderators feel it necessary to counter what I'm saying because they don't agree with me. Because I, for example, I am skeptical about a lot of the discussion around COVID. I'm skeptical about a lot of discussions today to do with freedom of speech, to do with cancel culture, etc. But they find it necessary to counterpose, just very, very usefully, very unobtrusively. There's a little box that says, click here to find out the truth. And I think this really is the problem. It's not whether they have moderators or not, or whether the moderators are algorithms, or whether they are semi-literate people in Asia or in India who are employed to look out for keywords or whatever. The problem is the concept of moderation. Because, and I suppose the thing I'd like to just throw out initially is one of, I think, the biggest problems we have is the idea that what we need to do is to protect the audience from views that are difficult or dangerous. And it's this assumption that the masses, the people, the ordinary people like you and me, have now become susceptible to fake news, that they are so stupid and gullible, unlike us experts and the elites who understand society, that we now need to protect them. So when we talk about free speech, it's not just about the individual right to say and express what you feel, but it's also about what the audience ought to be able to be exposed to. And I think that's a very fundamental point we need to think about, because it's the assumption behind so much of what we see happening in politics today, particularly, say, looking at populism in Europe, looking at Trump's election in America. It's all about, these people are stupid and that these elections were won through fraud or whatever, but it couldn't be a genuine reason why people might vote for these people. So I think that's a question perhaps we'll come back to. But
Pepin?
Well, there's a good meme going around these days, and it's a picture of it's an illustration of the Garden of Eden, and there's a serpent wrapped around the tree, and Eve is there, and she says, but God told me that if I eat it, I'll die. And the serpent says, yes, but independent fact checkers have proven that claim to be false. And I think, you can see meme culture has somehow survived all the other forms of censorship that are on social media, and I think that's really the point that I would start to make at the beginning. And I think you can see in meme culture that participants in social media are more cynical about it than they were 10 years ago. I mean, people know that there's a game. They can see what the rules are, and they can figure out how to get around them. So, I think it was about 10 years ago that the Wall Street Journal tried to show how Facebook was tailoring content to people on the basis of their political beliefs. I remember the Wall Street Journal had a section on its website where you could look at blue Facebook and red Facebook corresponding to left-wing and right-wing Facebook, or Facebook tailored for left-wing and right-wing audiences. And in blue Facebook, they would show you about, in America at least, the dangers of firearms. And on red Facebook or right-wing Facebook, it would be like, man heroically stops a mass killing through his use of his personal firearm at the mall, or something like that. And I think broadly the trajectory that played out is that platforms like Facebook used that tailoring to get people on, to attract people to them. But now when you log on, and Twitter tells you what the trending stories are, the trending story is always just like, Joe Biden is the most popular president in the history of the world. Anthony Fauci is the most popular doctor in the history of the world. So people see through it, and as often happens in systems like this, they figure out ways around it. So the real question, which we'll get to, is what one does in response to this. But I just wanted to put in a plug for meme culture as a way that people kind of cope with the system, and also have learned to navigate it. And I think particularly among young people, that cynicism about what the platform is palpable.
Thank you, Marianne.
Luckily, yet I haven't been banned from Facebook, but of course it can always happen. I've also experienced these double standards and the bias also on Facebook and on Twitter, because several times we can see that when we post something about these so-called controversial topics, about migration, LGBT issues, gender, etc., then we get these little additions there. Is that the fact checkers, and this is not necessarily true, etc. But whenever I see articles, very obviously fake news articles, for example, about the Hungarian government and members of the government, the craziest things from websites which publish like 100% clickbait fake news, and nothing happens to them. So you can report them, and you can also report these comments with all the death threats and other things about right-wing politicians or Hungarian politicians. And basically Facebook always answers that, yes, we can understand that this makes you upset and it makes you feel uncomfortable, but this is not against our rules, sorry.
Yeah, I had some experiences of Facebook moderation, which shows that Facebook moderation is broken. It never worked anyway, but probably will never work. First reason is because I think the algorithm of Facebook is now so complicated. They have been working on it for so many years. It's so complex that even in Facebook, they don't understand how it works anymore, really, and it's true. So they cannot fix it for sure. And so they put a layer of moderation on the top of that. Automatic moderation, which is most of the time, if you have had experience, is completely ridiculous, on keywords or stupid rules like this, or through human moderation, through people that you wonder if they have a brain that is actually functioning. And in France, our moderation is done in North Africa. And obviously, if you speak about Islam in France, which is a very hot topic in France right now, you are moderated by Muslim people speaking French. And obviously, it creates a lot of problems. So I have a lot of friends which I consider are moderates, who disappear from my Facebook wall for several weeks, and when they come back, they said, I've been in Facebook jail for 1 week, 1 month, and they reappear. My experience is my most popular post on Facebook. I had hundreds or maybe thousands of sharings. It was a joke, on a second degrees joke, as you probably experience. Second degree is not a good thing on social networks because a lot of people remain at the first degree, but still it was very popular. It was a joke about French history, really, just a joke. And it worked for several weeks, and after maybe 3 or 4 weeks, after it had already died, I received a message from Facebook, we have decided to hide, to limit the visibility of your post, and I still don't understand why. There was nothing offensive, it was a joke, it was very popular. So it's really strange. I think it doesn't work. And if you ask me, I think the day they decided to accept to moderate Facebook or Twitter under political pressure, they made the biggest mistake of their life. Because if one day some political power will decide to break Twitter or to break Facebook, it will be because of that problem of censorship on the social network, which is outrageous and dysfunctional.
I think we have a philosophical problem with the fact-checking phenomenon. That and this philosophical problem is called "Who guards the guards?" The other question is that that fact-checking outside the social media world has a professional field, and they call journalists. I mean, journalists have traditionally the role of fact-checking. But usually we know journalists by name, and we don't know by name the fact-checkers at Facebook and at other social media platforms. Is it a problem, or is it better for them, or for us, or how you see this problem?
I think the structure isn't working. In Germany, we have this strange situation that people are blocked on Facebook and Twitter or something like this by sharing content from our newspaper. So it's published already, they share it, and they get blocked. So we various times thought about what can we do, what could be a mechanism to handle this in a official, in a transparent, and in a way that a Western society can live with it. And I think you should pay for false blocks. So if you have to make transparent why you block somebody, and if it was a failure, you have to pay for it. This would, in my mind, would a method to reduce the number of failed blocks. And the other thing is you have to be very transparent as a platform why you block people. And this is really complicated to judge anybody. You don't find a CEO of Facebook Germany to put him in jail or something like this. And there have to be more transparent and efficient structures to control those blockings.
Well, to some extent, I don't agree with that. I think the problem is the concept of moderation and who gives them the right to decide this. Because the point about social media and about big tech is that they aren't accountable to you or me. They're accountable to their stakeholders, to their shareholders. They're not to you and me, the big people. They're not like politicians. No one voted for Mark Zuckerberg. No one voted for any of these CEOs of these companies who now have the right to determine whether we could say something or not. And I think the broader problem here, and this is what I'd like to throw into the discussion, because it's something I grapple with all the time, is that the power that these companies have got has been handed to them by government. because governments have refused to take responsibility for what I would say the defense of free speech. So what they've done is they've outsourced their authority to these platforms that have become this very powerful thing in society in a way that was not anticipated. I think this is a point to understand as well. Historically, the evolution of this, it's not that this was all predetermined. This is just the way this evolved over time. And the consequence of this is that they are now in more of a stronger position to control the public square than any government or entity in the history of capitalism. I'm particularly talking about in Western societies today, that they have more control over what can be said or not said or seen or whatever than any entity in the history of mankind has ever had. You know, Mark Zuckerberg is the lord over a space which is 3.9 million active people. That's more than the people of China and India together. He alone can say what they can and cannot say. How did we ever get to a situation where we've allowed something like this to come about? I think it's got to be resolved politically because it's a political issue. It's an issue of democracy. It's about who controls the public space and what I think has been a broader political change, which has been this erosion of the public and the private. And social media is not the cause. It's actually a symptom of a much bigger problem. And so the simple point I'm trying to get at is that the problem of what do we do about this is not a simple question of regulation in the old way, or the breakup of the monopolies like we would have done in the previous century with the robber barons or whatever. I mean, these are monopolistic entities, they are huge, but it's not a simple question. It's a question that requires a lot more public debate and discussion to really understand what we're dealing with here.
You know, in a way, the exemption of the major platforms from any kind of accountability for what is on them started a lot earlier. It started in the 1960s in the United States. And, you know, just to put in a kind of counterpoint here, it was really a free speech argument that drove the indemnification or exemption of publishers from responsibility for what goes in their pages. It goes back to the Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan, where the New York Times had printed an advertisement, you know, accusing, in effect accusing, this was during the Civil Rights era, they had printed an advertisement, in effect, accusing a public service commissioner in Alabama of, you know, being racist and responsible for all sorts of violent police crackdowns and so forth. And it was really after that time that the American public square shifted and, you know, became filled, you know, with you know, more, I guess, controversial political speech. Became much easier to make, you know, vicious accusations against your opponents because, in effect, we weakened our laws against libel and slander and things like that. So you could actually say that a certain excessive view of freedom of speech brought us to this situation. You know, I was intrigued by some efforts that were made in Poland at the beginning of this last year to introduce legislation to fine Facebook for removing people when it removes them from its platform, and they haven't violated any particular Polish laws. It seemed to me, I think that ultimately went nowhere. But it seems like that's the kind of legislation that, at least when we're dealing with the large platforms, would start to bring them a little bit more closely into you know, cooperation with or compliance with local law. I mean, the real question is, you know, where all of this is going in the long run. You know, maybe when Facebook started in 2004, it was you know, a unique software package. It's basically just commodity software at this point. It's not that difficult to replicate. And, you know, right now it's overt political interference obviously occurs primarily in the United States, at least in the big cases. But what happens 10 years from now when China says, we'd love to continue providing you with all the latest Huawei technology, and you know what, we can provide you a nice social media platform to be sure, it's going to be owned and operated by us, but you know what, at least the rules will be clear, and you won't be having to engage in a kind of shadow boxing with the American deep state. So, what happens when the media platforms start becoming part of that geopolitical struggle? Maybe they won't, but they already are on the peripheries. I think Nigeria banned Twitter a few months ago, something like that. So I'm really interested in where those problems that have been introduced, really going back to the 60s, are eventually going to head.
Just one more question for you, because you're from America. And in America, it's harder to stomach the idea that the state should regulate Facebook and other companies because of the idea of capitalism at America. Is it changing or not?
Well, they're the only industries we have now, so we've lost a lot of our other industries, so we've got to hold on tight to the social media platforms. And I think Trump thought the same way. When he was negotiating with or engaging in public combat with the EU over the tax question, he was in effect defending the position of those large American media empires. I guess he didn't believe until it actually happened that they could live without him, and maybe they couldn't live without him until the last minute. It's certainly starting to change. A couple of months ago at American Affairs, we published an article by Michael Lind, and he likened the situation of the American social media companies to the railroad companies. 120 years ago. Basically, these are companies that are controlling the new highways, the new basic traffic routes of modern information, and have established toll booths or choke points at which they're extracting something. So I think you're starting to see more thought like that on the right. There are kind of small policy areas where people are starting to explore this. So certainly all the tendencies are moving in that direction, but it's a gigantic problem. So.
Thank you, Marian. Are fact checkers editors over everyday journalists, unknown editors?
Well, it's interesting topic, certainly, and I very much agree with Norman's point on it, because it was strange to see how world leaders finally woke up when they saw that, well, if Facebook can erase the president of the United States, then something is certainly wrong with the system, because now it's just too big. And while they are debating about how to do something about this, Facebook just continues to grow, and Zuckerberg is already speaking about creating his own virtual reality, even though Facebook is already a virtual reality for many people, because, well, for many internet users, basically Facebook is the internet, and this is the place where they read the news, where they interact with people, where they are shopping. And of course, when we are speaking about how they are editing the news, the real problem is usually not about, well, obvious fake news, but how they have an agenda and how they are policing opinions, is how they are deeming some topics as taboos. Some topics that you can't even touch, you can't even speak about them, and also apart from this agenda, they are also silencing some people, while they are making some people a lot louder, and you can see them all over the place. And this is, well, nothing to do with how people are really thinking, how is the political situation in their countries, how it is representative to the user, but really about some agenda that they want to push through.
Okay, maybe we could switch to the European Union, the question of the European Union, because the European Union also would like to regulate these platforms, but as I said, they are reaching it from another point of view, and this point of view is partly data protection, partly business stuff and partly the hate speech. So they are not reaching it out as that they want to protect the free speech rights of EU citizens or citizens of EU member states, but they are concerned already or still with the hate speech stuff. And is it deepening the problem, or is it a kind of solution? Maybe a rhetorical question, but we can start from you.
Thank you. I think it's deepening the problem because hate speech is a very subjective notion. I think you can separate violent content from non-violent. This is quite clear and quite objective. When people are calling to violence, then you can censor it. It's quite obvious. But hate speech really is very subjective. And the notion of hate speech with all the woke culture is very extended now, to a point where people are censored for jokes or for things that are in the public debate and in the conversation of people in everywhere in the streets or in restaurants. So it doesn't make any sense. So I think I'm very surprised that the EU, for example, but it's true also in France, the politicians, like you said before, are worsening the problem with their obsession of regulation, like if regulation would ever solve any kind of problem. Regulation never solves any problem, and it will never solve a very complex technical problem. I think with the best will that they might have, if they have goodwill, which is to be proven, but let's say that the social networks will have a very good will to do the work of moderation. I think technically they can't do it. And so proposing regulation like the social networks will have to moderate hate speech in less than 24 hours, like I think there is a project like this at the EU level now, is totally crazy, because I think it's just impossible to do. And it will worsen the problem of the moderation, because when you have to do a moderation in a very quick time, it means that probably you will take the risk to moderate and not take the risk not to moderate. You know what I mean? If you have a 24 hours limitation, you will choose to moderate every time you can and not take the risk to have a trial and to go to court. So the censorship will become crazy. And I don't understand why the politicians always push their responsibility to the social networks. It will never work. But in a way, maybe it will be a good thing, because it will prove to everybody, every stakeholders, that it's impossible to ask the social network to moderate, and then we can come back to free speech, which was what the social network were in the beginning, when I used to like it. Now I don't like it so much. So for me, the only solution is to rediscover the virtues of total freedom of expression. And I think we will get to that point somehow in the future.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I'm really shocked sometimes as to why the EU is actually doing this, because it's not as if the social media companies have been against censorship, against, if anything. I would argue that the social media companies today have become the media wing of the new elite. They are pushing the woke agenda. We've made the point was made earlier in the earlier session today, that you can have a bearded billionaire Buddhist, sandaled Silicon Valley technocrat who can cut off a New York Post, a newspaper that was set up in defense of freedom of speech, etc., can just switch it off just like that. You can outlaw an elected president. Right? We're not talking about you or me, little people. This is a president who's elected by millions of people, can just be switched off from the public square, and he's got no recourse to appeal to the Supreme Court in America. He has to appeal to Facebook's oversight board. And who the hell are these people? And who elected them? And who voted for them? And why should they have a say over what he or should, whether he should be on the platform or not? So what I don't understand is why the danger, I think, of the EU doing this and moving into the space is simply to get us all to accept and acquiesce to the notion of the need to curtail free speech. That's where this is all going. This is an attack on freedom. And we should not be surprised, I mean, given who the EU are, and that, we've now got this kind of dictatorship of the technocrats in society, and anything that opposes that and will particularly argue for democracy or some kind of sovereignty or whatever is now regarded as anathema to the so-called Western values, which is just an absolute abrogation of what these things were in the first place. I think it's a very worrying situation because there's no control over this. Up until now, they've been quite happy for the social media companies to do what they ought to do. And I'll just end with one example. When Facebook first did its survey into whether it was meeting the standards of dealing with hate speech, it canvassed about 140 organizations in the US, NGOs, etc., and surprise, surprise, they came back and said Facebook are not doing a good job at curtailing hate speech, whatever hate speech is, as we've agreed is a very difficult thing to define. What happened? 140 attorney generals in the US wrote to Facebook a joint letter demanding that they start doing something about free speech, about hate speech. Now just think about this for a second in the context of America. This is not some kids in a basement. These are attorney generals who by law are supposed to uphold the First Amendment, who are arguing that a private entity that is not accountable to anybody should be curtailing free speech in America. That's the situation we've got to. And so the idea that the EU are somehow fighting Facebook or whatever, that the door has been wide open for years. They are marching in there. And we are all sitting back and thinking, oh yeah, maybe it's a good idea that they should do that, it should be the EU. But at the end of the day, we all end up suffering because we are all having our freedoms curtailed.
I just want to notice another point. Beside freedom of speech, it is a fact that those big online publishers, platforms, are gaining a huge amount of economical power with our contents. So for us as a publisher, it is a critical debate nearly every day. How can we get a fair share of the profit they made with our content? But it's a question of economical power in the whole society that they gain with our contents, and there's no solution yet.
There's going to come a point where Facebook is in conflict with a non-right-wing European government, and if our mental framework for approaching that situation is that regulation is always bad, then conservatives will have nothing to offer at all. So I think that framework can go, the free speech framework can go too far and ultimately make us powerless. Facebook is not the only economic actor in its space. There are other tech companies out there that don't like them. It's a game. Like you can make moves in the war with the platforms that you don't like through other actors. But I'll stick just to that point for the moment, though. That if we don't have a conception of what sort of regulation that we do want, if we just believe in the principle of freedom of speech only, then why should there be any restrictions on pornographic content on the internet, things like that? I mean, the ideal situation is one in which the major internet platforms are compliant with law, and if there are national laws that restrict pornography or LGBT content to minors, then those platforms should comply with that. Obviously, what that means is that free speech and its boundaries are conceptualized a little bit differently in each jurisdiction. So obviously we're a really long way from that, but I think if we just take the position that the ideal is like back to the internet of 1995, we're just going to recreate the situation for these huge platforms to arise again.
Marianne, as EU expert, what do you think about the EU's approach to the problem?
Well, I think that the EU is handling the issue of hate speech quite like it handles everything. So it always, it takes a long time. Nothing really happens. They have really endless discussions about nothing. And the whole problem with this, the concept of hate speech is that we can talk about it endlessly because, well, what is hate speech? For many people, hate speech is what I don't agree with or what I find just mean or rude. But that shouldn't be what we are calling hate speech. And of course, those people who are in these regulating authorities of Facebook, who are moderating and editing, and also those people who really like to report things, they usually have more or less the same agenda. And if you write on Facebook that I want to bomb down this or that country, you might not find yourself in a Facebook prison, but if you write something that men cannot give birth to a child, then it's quite probable that someone will find it hate speech.
Gladden Pepin said that it's a game, and if you remember the story of Rodeher and Mandiner, it was like Facebook management said, or Facebook moderator said that Rodeher was reported by many people. So maybe is the game of movements who is willing more to report somebody for the Facebook, and there are movements, political or lifestyle movements, which are very keen on to report somebody and some contents, and others are not. So if you are on the wrong side, it's just you should campaign your people, your, let's say, voters, that you should report more people from the other side too, or how you see it?
Yeah, try it out. I don't. Why
Could
not?
it work?
Yeah. What's that?
Could it work? Can you move enough people?
Yeah, I guess I meant more of a political game insofar as there are different corporate powers that could be balanced off of one another, perhaps. But just to remember how the game was played in the United States in about September of 2020. I remember, at the time I still listened to NPR, National Public Radio, on a regular basis. I gave it up at some point in the last year. I couldn't take it anymore. But I listened to it every morning, and there was a week or two in September of 2020 in which every morning NPR began with a story, and they said, will Facebook, Twitter, and the other social media platforms rise to the occasion? We know that this guy, President Trump, will send out all sorts of abusive content. Will they rise to the occasion? Sort of like they again, to use internet language, they memed Facebook into being prepared to take action. But then at the same time, you see in the months after the election, the social media platforms also let all of the extremist content, if you will, flourish. I mean, you could find every bit of content that led into the January 6th incidents was freely available. So maybe they were playing a slightly more sophisticated game, if you will, in choosing to allow content in order to provide an excuse for later suppressing it or something like that. So at the very least, we have to think in a more sophisticated or strategic way.
We discuss the topic right now from the civil society point of view. So the other side is, what shall we do if foreign powers use internet and those platforms, maybe sharing pics thousands of migrants crossing the Polish border. So they come in forehand in the political discussion. The pictures are spreading like a bushfire, and policy is most of the time very much on the second place. So this is I accompanied Chancellor Merkel for a couple of years, and I know that this is a big discussion in European governments, how to keep society together and how to avoid that on social media platforms the wrong information transform into political power. So this is a really complicated thing. As I know, there's a special social media factory in St. Petersburg producing special pictures and special messages to spreading out on social media platforms. And it's very hard to discover what is wrong and what is right. So it's sometimes a bit complicated to deal with this without any interference.
I think we've got to be careful here, because I think more often than not we confuse what goes on in social media and Twitter and all of these things as if this is the only world, as if this is the only place that people get their truth from or whatever. And, you know, it's still a very small number of people, actually, when you think about, who are actively engaged in these kinds of conversations on Twitter and everything, which is why it's so interesting that when you look at the social media and you look at what happens with social media around elections and what then the media draws from that in terms of what their predictions are for the outcomes, they get it totally wrong. Every single time they have completely misunderstood what was going on in society. So when Brexit happened or when Trump was elected, you know, everybody was shocked by this, as if, oh my God, you know, that's not what was being said on social media. And of course there's a big distinction to be made there. The point I'd like to come back to, however, is this point about regulation, because if you go back to the 19th century in America, when there was an attempt to regulate the so-called robber barons, the railroads, I think that what was previously referred to. What's so interesting about going back to the Sherman Act and examining that in some detail is that there was a discussion in America amongst the politicians that they recognized that they had to curtail the power of these entities because there was too much power concentrated in the hands of private individuals. And Herbert Hoover, who became the president, made the point. He said that we cannot have a situation where a few individuals determine and dictate what should be allowed to be said in public in America. Now, that's going back. Yeah, what's changed? What's changed is that you don't have politicians saying that anymore. If anything, they have handed the keys over to the social media companies and basically absolved themselves of responsibility of defending the First Amendment, of defending free speech. And I don't think that we can play around with this concept of free speech. I think free speech is a fundamental principle, unlike everything else, whether it's pornography or whatever. Free speech is fundamental to democracy because without free speech, there is no possibility of contestation about ideas, about challenging what other people think. If we don't defend that as our foundational principle, then everything else falls. Everything else is just a chimera. It does not exist. And that's why I think we've got to uphold that as the starting point, not as a kind of convenient afterthought about how we might regulate things like child pornography or violence or whatever. I think these are very fundamental points, specifically today, in how that has become so eroded. So I think we've got to uphold that as a starting principle.
So you think that self-organization is enough to keep this in view? Like maybe Speaker's Corner is a platform too. So if somebody is speaking hatred or something like this, the audience will interrupt and shout something like this.
No.
So, but is this working on social media platforms too?
Well, it doesn't work like that at the moment, but the principle surely has to be that you think the audience are capable of being able to distinguish between fake news or falsities or whatever. And if you don't have that as a working assumption, then essentially you are part of the problem, because you're saying that certain people have to be protected from certain kinds of speech. Where do you draw the line? Who are you to make that distinction? Instead of upholding the principle that this should be open to debate, that we should treat each other as adults that are capable of learning and listening to other people and changing our opinions without seeking, becoming violent or behaving like children, stomping around and saying, well, I find that offensive. That's the way you close things down. I think we've got to open things up.
Thank you very much. We are already in the questions time. So I will give you the first question from the audience with my last question together. And also you can share your thoughts which you didn't share with us. My last question is the main question: platform or publishers? If it would be better to regulate these social media platforms as publishers because they edit the content. And maybe the first question from the audience is a little bit linked to this question. If there is a chance for creating national sovereign social media platforms?
So for me, there are platforms. They should have stayed platform. There are more and more publishers because we have allowed them to moderate, but they should have stayed platform and with free speech. That's my answer. For the creation of national social networks that will compete with the domination of Facebook, I think it's almost mission impossible. I've tried all these conservative social networks. Doesn't work. It's a gathering of freaks and very far right people who are sharing their crazy ideas together, which is fine with me, but it is not interesting for others. So it just doesn't fly. And so to replicate success of social networks, it will take a lot of money and a lot of time. I don't say it's impossible, but it's almost mission impossible. So the solution, in France, we have one of the main candidates right now who is telling that he will, if he's elected president, he will erase all the laws in France which have limited freedom of speech in France. And on that basis, it would be possible then to say to the social networks in France, you're not allowed to moderate because there is freedom of speech in France now. And I think it will solve most of the problem. But creating a French social networks, I think, and it will come from the state, I suppose, by the way. So no way. The only way would be to ban these social networks from the country if it was proven that they don't respect the national laws. And then maybe you have a room to create some competition. But other than this, I don't think it's possible.
Marianne? Oh, we had one anyway, the IVIV before. It was not an official one, but a national.
Yeah, true. Well, if the question is platforms or publishers, I think that Facebook wants to have, well, the best of both worlds. So they want to have the power to regulate, to moderate, to have an agenda, but also when there is some responsibility, they want to say that, oh, well, we are just a platform. When it comes to other social media, I also think that it is almost mission impossible because also Facebook is relying on the big tech companies which more or less agree with it and are satisfied with it, I guess. And the vast majority of people don't use social media to have political arguments with strangers. So they just want to have a platform which is convenient, which has all the features, and where they can find most of the people whom they know, regardless of what they think about politics. So if there is a new social media site based on worldviews, it usually stays fringe, I think. And also, well, Facebook has this very convenient approach, is that if you don't start arguments and if you don't write, well, comments that they find offensive, then basically they are keeping the system convenient for you, and they can keep you in your own opinion bubble based on the sites which you are liking, the comments which you're liking, well, because they want you to stay there and to view their advertisements and to buy. So they don't necessarily want to make your life a living hell on social media if you don't, well, provoke them.
No, it's a very good question, and we've all talked about how governments don't want the responsibility of regulating large platforms themselves, and so in some way they outsource to Facebook and the other social media platforms. But I mean, can every country outsource to the same platforms? I mean, ultimately the platforms will be implementing someone's policy, and they probably can't implement the policy of dozens of different governments at the same time. But if that's the direction things are pushing, if particular governments want speech on these platforms regulated in particular ways, then yeah, at some point there are going to be national platforms. Maybe it's not in Western Europe. Maybe it's somewhere in Africa. Nigeria banned Twitter. Again, the technology is not that hard. It's not super complicated to design. It's just complicated to distribute, and Facebook and these other American platforms happen to get there first. But with more power comes more responsibility, and they'll probably get themselves into some very hairy situations soon.
Which is why I think Facebook will welcome regulation. They want the space regulation precisely because at this point in time they are facing competition. They are beginning. If you looked at the Wall Street Journal's exposés, all the papers that came out, the whistleblowing papers that came out on Facebook, one of the most important points that it was exposed was how vulnerable Facebook are for the future, precisely because they are losing, as they say, the pipeline, because they are losing young people. They are not able to, which is partially the reason why they're moving to the metaverse. Is not to try and escape reality. It's because they need to attract a young audience. They understand, because they have been a product themselves of what changes took place in society with young people in particular. We haven't had time to discuss this. A very important aspect of this is that the emergence of social media had very little to do with the technology as such. It had more to do with changes in culture, in the way that childhood had changed, and why young people were looking for solutions that could allow them to escape the gaze of their parents while they were in the presence of parents, which they attracted to cyberspace. That's where it came from. And so publisher or platform, I think, is possibly the wrong question, because I think social media is so much more than publishing. And towards my last comments, I want to make a positive case for social media. Because I think if you stand back from it and you think about what social media, what we call social media, which in fact is social networking, it's so much more than just the publishing of news and opinion. You think about this. In the history of society, of civilization, when have we ever had a situation where billions of people can be connected in real time on a platform where you could collaborate, you could cooperate? We're talking about 3.9 billion people on Facebook alone, never mind all the other platforms, who, if you think about it, it's 3.9 billion brains connected in real time. You think about the scale of some of the problems we are facing today, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's to do with COVID, the cures for cancer or whatever. That is a supercomputer, which is greater than any AI endeavor that's being done at the moment. think about that for a second, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the potential of what we could do with something like that. And so I say, Facebook is facing problems, which is great, because it means other people are starting to think about alternatives, which means that there is space for things to happen on national levels. And this is not an inevitable world. What we have now, the present, is not the future. And if anything to go by about the internet, it's very difficult for us to predict what that future is going to be. The future has not arrived, and it's certainly not closed, and it's certainly not Facebook.
The question is simple, and the answer is simple. Both platforms are publishers and platforms, but I think we discussed a lot on the surface of the problem. We, as a media house, try to understand how those social media platforms work. Especially Apple has grown a news aggregator. If you swipe to the left on your iPhone, and we don't have any idea why special news are on the top for days. Maybe a crab with a diamond in his shell. So nobody knows it. So turn this into a political question. They can use the political agenda on these aggregators. Facebook is establishing such a platform. Another point, those big technology enterprises are buying more and more everyday life enterprises. Google has bought Nest, which is a company with computer-based heating controllers. So they know when you come home and turn on the heater. Every Xbox and gaming station has today 6 or more cameras with face so that they know in which mood you are gaming aggressive plays, or you take a TV channel which is connected with the gaming station. You saw comedies, or you see thrillers or something like this. Of course, there are microphones that can listen into your room, so you can say, Siri, tell me something. So combined with the algorithms of social media platforms, the potential of leading society in very deep ways is given. It's there, and the point would be to make it as transparent as possible to understand how they work and what the algorithms are. This is a point of view. I think it's most important.
Thank you very much. Our time is over. Thank you for your thoughts. I hope it would be good for you to listen to our guests, and have a nice time later. And if some questions remained, I guess you can reach the panelists to ask your questions too. Thank you very much.